I've made just a few modifications to the scene. I've gone ahead and removed the procedural terrain, and actually, I did notice that there was a problem with the bump channel when using the camera projection. So what I've done is create a new map, and we're gonna switch over to Photoshop, and I'm gonna show you uh, how we can create a bump using Fractal and also part of the render we created earlier in order to bring back some of the detail. And I'll just show you what I currently have. This is a lower res render, but you'll be able to see some of the new detail showing up in various areas of the terrain. And I'll render that a little bit larger. And you can see it is rendering much quicker because we do have a standard, just a standard terrain with that map on it. But adding that very simple bump really brings out a lot of the detail. So we're not losing some of the elements that we had before. And overall, it looks a lot better. So from the map we were working on earlier, or I had open, I was able to create this bump. And it looks like I did miss one of the shadows. But what I did was take a couple of the passes. Basically, if we take the diffuse lighting output from the multipass, and I'm just going to create a new document with that layer. So selecting it, select all, copy. Whenever you copy and then file new or control N, it will retain the clipboard information. So whatever's copied, that resolution will carry over. You can really easily just paste it in. So first, what I wanted to do was remove some of these shadows. And in this case, what I did was just take the clone stamp tool. And I have some brushes I created previously. If you don't know how to create a new brush, uh, since I want to match the terrain slightly in order to remove the information and cut away from it, if you do want to create a new brush, all you need to do is just select an area that you'd like to become a brush. So what we could do is just use the lasso tool, select a small portion, copy it, create a new document, paste it in. If you want to go in, maybe using quick selection tool and maybe go around the edges. And this is a rather small document. I am going to deselect that. Maybe work with a slightly smaller brush. One thing that's really important is when you're using the quick selection tool that you right click and go to refine edge, and that way you can adjust the selection and then delete. I do want to make this a little more contrast. We might want to smooth that out a little. Basically what you could do is now Control A to select it, and what you can do is go up to Edit and define Brush Preset. And now you can see that brush showing up. So if we want to select it, use the clone stamp tool, right click, and now we can see that brush showing. And if we want to modify it, we can go to the Brushes tab. You can go to Window and Brushes. I'm going to turn on Scattering and just space it out a little. And under Shape Dynamics, check that on. Increase the angle jitter, which will skew it a little. We could do some size jitter, and that should be good. So now we can match the terrain and just clone some of the areas and get rid of that shadow. And that'll match up a little closer to the terrain than just a standard brush would. And we're also going to remove a lot of the dark areas, but mainly it's getting rid of these harsh lines. I'm not too worried about the tone, because this is just going to be a distribution, and a fairly simple one. You could go in if you wanted to and sample maybe some of the areas on the lit side of the diffusion and fill in some of the parts, but basically we'll want to have sort of like we did with the color channel. You could even use that color channel or the distribution created earlier to do this, to distribute and create the mask, which would be this layer created earlier. So this would also work pretty well. So we can save that out and give it a try along with this one. But basically I just want to remove all the harsh edges. And what we can do is go to Adjustments and Shadow and Highlight, and then adjust how we'd like to remove the shadows. And this is kind of a advanced high pass filter. So you could go a little more extreme with it. Keep in mind it doesn't get rid of absolute values. Highlight of complete white or black, it's not necessarily going to remove. It's going to take care of mostly the in-between areas of definition. But we could use something like that to disperse the bump. And then also go back and select the shadow layer. Paste that on. I also want to note that the shadows are going to be colored, as you can see. So if you need to, you can convert the document over to grayscale. Not going to merge it. And if you don't want to just do a direct conversion to grayscale, and you do want to select specific colors to be either lighter or darker, then you could use image adjustment in the black and white filter. But since it was all basically the same shade, this will be good enough. So we can set this to darken, or we can lighten, or you use a direct opacity amount, use some different blending styles, just to create an interesting distribution based on the image. You could also use this to control exactly where ecosystems are going to be showing. So we could use an occlusion layer. There's really quite a bit. I'm going to go to the darken setting, and then we'd be able to use this for the distribution. Doesn't look as close as this one. So it really depends on the style you're using and the different blending modes. If you set it to lighten and pick that up a little, we're going to get something a little bit closer to the map I had. But I also want to save this out as a distribution. So we can save both of those and then bring them into view. Before I save this, I want to note that the method I was using before to save just as a copy, well, this is a RGB image, and the file size is going to be much smaller if it's grayscale. So you can copy the layer, create a new document, convert it to grayscale, and then save it, and you'll end up with a much smaller file size. turn off layers, turn off the profile, and it looks like I saved that as a Photoshop file. And I do want to use a TIFF. And compress it, discard the layers. And over in View, what we can do, we open the material, I edit the function. What I did was I adjusted that highlight map, but we're going to create this little distribution here where we start with a texture map, and I'm going to load in that other bump. We could use that as a bump or the distribution. Using it directly as a bump does seem to have some problems with the camera projection. I was having some problems where nothing would really show up, no matter how intense I made the bump. Because of the camera projection, it wasn't really working, but as a distribution, it seems to work pretty well. Not really sure exactly why that is. It could be based on scale. Something could have happened to the scene, or the image just could not really work for it. Also could be a matter of the scale I was rendering, since we were working with a 3000 by 3000 pixel image. So what I want to do is add in a fractal, just a simple fractal, and what I have it set to is Cellular Patterns Voronoi, which is a little more complex than some of the other fractals, and it can take longer to calculate, but it does look pretty good. And I've got the metascale set at around 30, largest feature at 6. Metascale, if you're not familiar with what it does, it is the grouping of the largest features. It creates groups of large elements and higher points. And then I have roughness at 0.52, gain at 0.8. And what I want to do is create a blend between the fractal and nothing. So either it uses the fractal or it uses no bump whatsoever. So we're not going to connect this second part of the blender. And this is set to blender because as a combiner node, there's a lot of different options, but we're using the blend, and we're going to control the ratio between the fractal and nothing with this image map, which we have connected to the camera projection. And then connect our bump to that output. And I had the bump set to 1 right now, which might be a little high. We could just go ahead and take a look. And I might need to invert the image, because right now it looks like it's affecting the grass, where I really want to affect the mountains more. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel that. What we can do is go back, edit the function, and just in the texture map, in the upper right of the preview, you can invert it. So now we're going to have an opposite distribution, where it's just going to show up along where the rocky surfaces are. And now we can see all that new detail showing. And this is a little different than the one I was showing earlier, because I did have some distribution in other areas. So this one's based on the color map. Or we could base it on the other image we used based on the diffuse. And it looks like I might need to invert it. Oh, and it looks like I didn't. So I'll go back, edit the function, invert that. And now we can see that being distributed, either no bump or just the fractal showing up in a couple of different areas around the terrain. The intensity of the blend and the ratio controlled by that grayscale image. Now I'm going to create a copy of the camera and move over and just show you some of the things we can do with this camera projection. This actually does give us the ability to maneuver around the scene provided enough detail is filled in. So this is a great way to set up animation. You, in this case, it looks like maybe I need to increase that bump size. So I'm going to go into the fractal and just make the largest feature a little bigger, decrease the gain. And you can really do whatever you want with that, modify it a little more or less. Bring the bump down to 0.5 for the intensity, so it's a little more subtle. But provided you stay within the camera projected area, you can move the camera around and render very quick animations. Once we move outside, if we take a look over here where the camera ends, we can see the seam, and then the material starts to repeat itself. Now the options for that are located within the node, where we can see the tiling mode is set to repeat on the X and the Y. If we set it to none, then nothing is going to show up. And I'll just set this to the color. So now you can see that all we have is that highlight map and the bump affecting the side. So that's a good way to also get a clear sense of where it is you can navigate within the scene. Also keeping in mind that you will end up having some stretched areas. Because this did change the OpenGL preview, I am going to set this back to repeat. If you want to get rid of the seam, you could set it to mirror. And that way, just in case you get outside of the bounds of the camera projection, then you've still got some detail. And you won't have a seam. But if we take a look over on some of the side areas that didn't have a direct projection, you are going to notice some stretched zones. Now, one thing you could do, especially for like an animation or anything like that, is set up another camera and render it out and project onto the terrain as another layer. So basically putting one image on top of another in order to fill in those spaces. And that's just a really simple alpha setup. It's also possible to set up within the material, adding another layer and using the environment tab to just cover a specific slope range, or also using the orientation constraint, which is a preferred orientation controlling the direction which the material will be placed, and then how closely the material will be placed along that orientation. So now I've just added a grass layer on top of the terrain, and we can see it showing up along one specific direction. So what we can do is adjust the preferred orientation, change the degree, and now map it on this side. So you could do that with an image as well, and have a little bit of a blend automatically set up without having to create any special alphas. With this technique where you're going to be creating another render from another view to fill in detail, it's a good idea to create an alpha that cuts out the edges so that you don't have any seams as part of the overlay. And in this case, since we modified the image maps, you would also need to use the exact same process to create the color map for the new projection as you did earlier, which is why saving that procedural terrain version from before is very important. But now we can see that new material showing up in that direction. So that's another way you could work with that to fill in some of those stretched areas, whether with an image or another material. I'm going to go ahead and just delete that layer. And if you're using a map that already has shadows and you want to use the ignore indirect lighting, ignore atmosphere, and just use the render from before, so then you don't have to worry about the shadows in the scene, anything like that. That works great for terrain animation. You could render out a terrain pass that way very quickly, and then create another pass with the ecosystem and separate it. Now you can use either the multipass for this and separate out the ecosystem, or you could create a matte object and basically render on top of that. Now, the best thing to really do to make sure that the alphas and the anti-aliasing match up around the edges of plants so that the blend color uh, is exactly what it would be with the final output, the map we're currently using would work the best. Like I was saying, really just a matter of adjusting the lighting and whether or not you want to have the original render or use the new lit version with these shadows like I have set up right now where it's basically a material. As for the atmospherics, I always suggest basically taking care of that in post. Use the Z depth and really focus on atmospherics that way because you don't want to have to re-render something if you want to change the atmosphere. And this way, you'll be able to create a render, use the Z depth, and add in any sort of atmospheric to it, which makes it a lot easier. Now, if you need a little more control over your standard terrain and the geometry, what you might need to do is bake it to polygons. Right-click with the object selected, select Bake to Polygons, and then you can define the mesh resolution. Currently in the scene with 1024 by 1024 pixel amount for the definition of the terrain, we have a little over 2 million polygons in the scene with just the standard terrain. You could either reduce that pixel amount or you can use this option to bake either higher or lower. And we'll just go ahead and set to, that would be about 58 to 60% of the option for the bake quality. And it looks like Vue is running into a little bit of an error here. This is in fact inaccurate. And actually, now that I've baked it, we still have the exact same amount of polygons in the scene. They are processed a little bit differently because it's no longer a standard terrain. The amount of memory it's really using, I highly doubt that just this one terrain is more than the 8 gigs I currently have in the system. And on a Windows system, you can open the Task Manager to really see what's going on. Photoshop is currently running and using about 2 gigs. So probably should close that out. And that might be why I'm getting close to the memory limit. Although I still have quite a bit available. We can see that Vue might be having a little bit of a memory issue because right now it is currently using the CPU even though it's doing nothing. And it's also increasing the memory even though it's not really doing anything. So there might be a little bit of a leak there. In that case, the best thing to do is really just close the scene after saving it, reopen it. With the terrain being baked, we have a little more control over the quality. You might notice system performance decrease because the terrain is not being updated as the camera moves closer. It's giving us a constant amount of geometry. You can modify these settings. Now normally I have my instant draw and plant draw turned all the way up, but while I'm recording I end up with some issues because of that, so I do have to turn them down. But decimated mesh previews will increase scene times, background draw. there's quite a few options that can speed up a scene. Another thing you could do is just simply hide this terrain from the scene and pay attention to the preview render if needed. But if we take a look at the terrain and now edit the object, we've got some new options since we're working with a polygon mesh and not just a terrain. We now have the ability to bake illumination maps onto the object, which you can't do with the standard terrain, although sometimes it's kind of done automatically when moving through an animation. But this way we can define quality of the indirect lighting, any sort of situation we want to have that way. We can also modify the smoothing angle, and with this sort of a terrain, you'd really want to have a value of 90% or more. Going below 90% is going to take the peaks and possibly make them sharp, depending on how much geometry there is. I'm going to bring that down to 90. And what it's going to do is re-smooth the mesh based on that new angle. And that's basically kind of a Phong shader and shading method for the overall object. We'll let that finish up. And if you notice any sharp polygons or any major distortion, then you'll need to turn that value up and increase it. Another thing, if you go back, is the dynamic subdivision, which will increase the polygon geometry of any object, any polygonal object you've imported or baked in the scene, and it will subdivide. But the main thing is it will not create any extra depth within the overall object. Because there's nothing really defining the in-between values. It doesn't work like other programs might subdivide. If you're a Cinema 4D user, it would be kind of like a HyperNurbs. That sort of rounding is not available in Vue. What it does is just will divide the polygon and keep dividing the polygon. If you have displacement map set up, so if you go into the material, onto the bump channel, there's also displacement mapping. That will control the subdivision. So that's really the only way to control that subdivision is with the displacement map. The bake method is also the best way to export objects, terrains out of Vue. Exporting directly from the terrain editor causes a lot of problems. A lot of extra polygons are created. The overall point distribution doesn't work right, and every format creates a different type of object. Baking it directly in the program first and then exporting the object out is the best way to go. And what you can do is go to File and Export Object, and then you can choose from the different formats. So you can do a 3ds file, a C4D, TrueSpace file. Not sure how often that's used anymore, although here they are making some large improvements. So there's also the DXF file, LWO, Lightwave Export, and OBJ. Now, if the program you're exporting to supports more than one format, that's a huge plus, because if you run into a problem with one of the formats you've chosen, you can switch to another format. The Wavefront OBJ file, I often have trouble with. When directly exporting a terrain out, it can have some errors. 3ds seems to be probably one of the most compatible, although I have noticed that the C4D file works really well. So those are some really good starting points and good options. When you're exporting the objects, the polygon faces and the normals will probably be facing the wrong direction, though. So they may need to be inverted. So I'm going to go ahead and save this scene out and we're going to take a look at the extreme options that are available. Uh, we're going to be able to create some much more dramatic effects and have a lot better control over the terrain and lighting when using another application, especially one that supports normal mapping. Um, with this new baked terrain, we will have a little more geometry, and with the added bump map, it does look a little better. If I go ahead and move the terrain, or move the camera around some of these bumpier areas of the terrain, and if we just take a look, we can see that we don't have nearly enough detail. With the way the shadows are set up, it just does not look right. There's also some lighting errors, and I may have the quality boost turned down. I don't. So actually, yeah, that is either a problem with the smoothing or just view itself and how it handles some of this information since we don't have normal maps. So I'll save this out, and we're going to take a look at the scene with some of the extreme options and how we can really, really get the most out of this scene.